So last time we looked at the details of the creation of man and woman, and we looked at God's provision of Garden of Eden for them to live in. And we looked at marriage as a partnership between counterparts, that God had created woman as a counterpart to man, not identical to man, not subservient to man, not superior to man, but as a counterpart, a partner. And then we looked at the first commandment. Well, not the first commandment, but the commandment to not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then we looked at their failure to obey that. And then at the end of chapter 3, we saw that God had pronounced judgment in those 3 poems on the serpent and on the woman and then on the man. And then in his judgment of the woman, he put that messianic prophecy that through the seed of the woman, the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head, and he would bruise the seed's heel. And of course, the seed being Jesus. So now, in chapter 4 and 5, what we're going to see is a couple of genealogies, and they take the descendants of Adam and Eve down to Noah. When we, I don't think we'll actually look at the other genealogies. This genealogy in Genesis only goes down to Noah, and then there are a couple other genealogies in Chronicles and in Luke and in Matthew and in Acts, I believe, that carry it from there to Jesus. But since we're not doing those books, we won't be covering them. But if you're interested, on the website there's a comparison, a side-by-side comparison of those. They're not identical. So these 2 genealogies that we're going to look at tonight, the first carries the descendants of Cain down for a few generations, and then it leaves Cain, goes back to Adam, and then follows Seth to Noah. And so we'll look at those, but first we need to look at the story of the very first murder. Genesis is a book of firsts, right? So the story of Cain and Abel in chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "Now Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain." Cain means possession, saying, "I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord." And again, she bore his brother Abel, which means breath. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. I think it's cute that even today, that many Bible translations still use that cute euphemism for sexual relations. He knew his wife, right? Other translations have equally cute modern euphemisms. But regardless of what we call it, Eve recognized, and it's clear from this. She says, "I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord." She recognized God's hand in the conception and the childbearing of Cain. Now, you notice that I didn't refer to Cain as Adam and Eve's firstborn. Certainly Cain is the first mentioned of their children, but there's no, that doesn't necessarily imply that they didn't have other children before that. Cain is the first mentioned because God had something to say, or he might have been the firstborn too. We don't know. But anyway, God had something to say about Cain, something fairly important, as we'll see. But this is an important principle that we need to keep in mind. God does not tell us everything in his word.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And, I have 2 questions here. How could he? And why should he?
Yeah.
Right? He tells us what we need to know, and he tells us what we're able to handle. One of my favorite quotes from Jesus is from the upper room. He said, I have much more to tell you, but you can't handle it right now. But when the Helper comes, he'll reveal to you all truth. All right?
But this says again, we don't know how many brothers and sisters he had.
Well, Jesus, you mean? Well, we know
We
we know he had at least 2 sisters, and we know of Jude and Joseph, right? Wasn't the other one?
Was James his brother?
No, Jesus's.
Jesus the brother.
Oh, James's brother too. So we know he had at least 3 brothers, and at least 2 sisters, because it says his brothers and sisters are with us, right? Mm-hmm. But we don't know how many others Mary had.
I mean, but we don't need to.
Right.
Well, that's the thing about.
It's about him. It's not them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, go to the end of the book of John where he said,
If he wrote everything
if he wrote
about
everything
it,
that he did, the book, there wouldn't be enough books to contain
Yep,
it. So,
yep.
and
the principle is that he doesn't tell us everything. He tells us what we need to know. And what's really amazing, what's positively amazing, it continually fills me with awe, is, as the Hebrews writer said, this word is living and powerful. We will go back to a passage that we think we've got, and there's something new there. Because we have grown to the point where we can take it in now. Right? He reveals to us what we're able to handle and what we need to know.
Yeah, I read the Bible through every year.
Mm-hmm.
I've done that for close to 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And there's never a time I've read it through that I don't remember ever seeing that.
Yeah.
And I read it in different translations, so sometimes there's nuances of meaning that come out that I didn't realize before. But and the thing is, the Bible was written so that we would, for a theological purpose.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't written so we would know the exact history of Israel. I'm not saying that it doesn't have true history in it, but I'm just saying that's not the purpose, or scientific things or whatever. The important stuff is theological all the way.
Well, you all know my favorite quote from Martin Luther: "Die ganze Schrift treibt Christum." The whole Scripture pertains to Christ.
Amen.
Anyway, and remember, we talked about this last time. Names have significant meanings. A lot of them do, and sometimes there are these little plays on words. Like with Cain, Cain's name means possession, and so Eve said, "I've gotten a man from the Lord." Right? There are a lot of these little plays on words. So continuing on in verse 3, it says, "In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard." Now, this is fruitful ground for, trite jokes about God not being a vegan, and, how much better meat smells on the barbecue than vegetables do. But the important point here isn't what Cain and Abel brought, it's why they brought it.
Yep.
And that's what he's trying to teach us. The writer of Hebrews, in Hebrews 11:4, the Hall of Faith chapter, talked about Abel's offering, and it says, "By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, he still speaks to it." That's amazing.
Looking back just a little bit, when Adam and Eve sinned, they tried to cover themselves with leaves, and that wasn't good enough. God covered them with animal skins,
Right, with the
required a
sacrifice. Yeah, we talked about that last time, and that was the first slaughter, the first sacrifice.
And I'm saying the vegetation wasn't sufficient.
Fig leaves are kind of itchy too.
But here again, it's not what they brought, it's why they brought it. Abel brought of the firstborn of his flock. And, he recognized, like Eve recognized that Cain was a blessing from the Lord, Abel recognized that this firstborn of his flock was a blessing from the Lord, and he wanted to show gratitude for it. And furthermore, there was an element of risk in Abel's offering, because there was no guarantee there would ever be any secondborn or thirdborn, right? That this was his firstborn. He was bringing his best. We talk about this a lot with regard to our food ministry. We don't want to give our cast-offs. Mm-hmm. We want to give of our best, of the blessings that we have. And why? Because it's a witness. It's a proper witness.
When I was in college, I went to Decatur First Baptist Church for a while, and they had a clothes closet, and they would not accept used clothes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Buy something new if you want to bring it.
Yeah, they took donations, but it had to be new clothes. They did not give secondhand clothes to. And I'm not saying it's wrong to give secondhand clothes, because it's better for somebody to be able to use them that doesn't have anything. Mm-hmm. I go get secondhand clothes myself.
To make food shops for.
Yep. So God honored Abel's offering because of the spirit in which he brought it. Now, by the way, thousands of years later, God formalized the requirement for the firstborn to be devoted to him, and then he formalized a system for the redemption of the firstborn as a foreshadowing of his giving of his firstborn for the redemption of mankind out of sin. You can read about that in Numbers 18 if you're interested. So by contrast, the spirit that Cain brought his offering in must have been different. Now, we don't know this from the text, but we can infer it from God's reaction. Maybe Cain had seen Abel bring an offering, and he thought, oh, well, I guess that's what you do, right? And so maybe he just assumed that he should do so. We don't know this from the text, and we need to be careful about reading things into the text. But there was something about the attitude that Cain brought his offering with that was not pleasing to God. Maybe he just didn't bring it in that same spirit of faith and gratitude. Certainly it didn't carry the same element of risk that Abel's did.
The other thing is Cain's, part of the curse was that you had to till the ground and produce your food by the sweat of your brow. Mm-hmm. And that's what Cain's offering was the fruit of his works, where Abel's was, the life of
of God's blessing.
Yeah, and I've heard that used in part of it too. It could have been his pride. Look
God
what I've
blesses
done.
through cropping too. You're not going to get a crop if the Lord doesn't bless it.
Well, regardless of the specific of these two offerings, Cain's and Abel's, it's clear from this story what God's
heart that made a difference.
What's God's requirement for our attitude in bringing our offering is. It not so that we might be honored by other people, but in a true heart of contrition and faith and trust. When Jesus healed people, many times, most times, as he was leaving them, he would say, "Your faith has made you well." He's honoring the faith and the trust, and that brought to my mind the story of the widow's offering in Luke 21. It says, Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box, and he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had to live on." So, continuing on in the second half then of Genesis 4:5. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, Will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, and that's L again, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It's contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Now, this is the first instance of jealousy, and it's the first instance of anger with God. And I think that, I can only speak for myself, but I think we're all subject to that. Cain was angry with God because he didn't understand. He didn't understand what the difference was. And God came to him to teach him. This is what's going on. Something about his own nature, and Cain's proper response to Abel's blessing should have been joy, sharing in it. Not envy and coveting Abel's blessing for himself in Abel's place. But we're subject to this sin of covetousness, and that is the sin that God is warning Cain about here, is coveting. Now, in verse 7, as I said, it says that the sin's desire is contrary to you. That's another instance of this controversial English language translation of the word L that's in the ESV, but not in most of the others. Remember in Genesis 3:16, when God was pronouncing judgment on Eve's disobedience, he said that your desire shall be contrary to your husband in the ESV, right? Well, the ESV was the only one that translated it that way. Most of the other ones translate it as for, and it's the same here in this verse. Most of the other versions translate L in this verse as for, F-O-R. But here in this verse, it has a little bit different connotation. God was saying that sin was seeking to come after Cain to harm him. It's for, and that, you know what that reminded me of, just to tell you how strange my mind is. Remember in Star Trek, Lee Merriweather, right? That which survives. I am for Kirk. I don't know if you'd have to be really old to get that reference. But it was this. It was this automated, like, killer android thing or projection, and it always, whenever the computer made one, it made one for one specific victim. So she'd pop up. I am for D'Amato. I am for Kirk. Anyway. So, anyway, God was warning Cain about covetousness and that it would come after him to do him harm. So in verse 8, it says, Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now, some of the ancient manuscripts, add a phrase to verse 8, indicating that Cain spoke to his brother to lure him out to the field to kill him. That's not in all the manuscripts, and it didn't make it into this translation. It didn't make it into most of the translations. But regardless of whether Cain premeditated this murder or whether he just rose up against Abel in a fit of anger, what was done was done. He murdered his brother. It doesn't really matter whether he planned to do it ahead.
They pose the question the way it's written. You can say, "Oh, what's that mean?" And then you say, "Oh, he killed him." Oh, that's what it means. That's the important part. Mm-hmm. That's what happened.
Now, what's interesting here is God hadn't formally outlawed murder, right? Yeah. Not for a long time to come, but we're born with revulsion toward it. Mm-hmm. That's part of that. Remember when we talked about in the creation, in day 6, he said he created man in his image and likeness, right? Part of that image and likeness is an abhorrence for murder. We didn't have to be told that it was bad, right? Because we already knew. Anyway, so in his shame and in his guilt, remember, shame and guilt were part of that curse that was brought in by Adam and Eve. Cain compounded his sin by telling the first lie that a human being ever told to God. And Adam and Eve, they told the truth. They were kind of spinning it, but they didn't lie, right? Cain's lying outright. I don't know. My brother's keeper. Well, of course he knew, and God knew too. God's question for Cain here, what have you done? Where's your brother? Wasn't for God's information. Right? Mm-hmm. It was to bring into focus for Cain the realization of what he'd done, so he might repent, to give him an opportunity to turn and be saved. Anyway.
Same as God's question to Adam after the fall. Adam, where are you?
Yep. Yeah, it's the same thing. He wanted to gently lead them into the realization of just what had come about and what was about to come about with his judgment. And so Abel became the first in a long line of righteous martyrs, and this always reminds me of a quote from Jesus. If you read those woes, I think this is one of no, it's not. But if you read the things that he said to the Pharisees, it's not any wonder that they wanted to kill him. And if you read the 95 Theses that Martin Luther nailed up on the church door, it's no wonder the Pope wanted in his head. It wasn't very gentle. And anyway, so Jesus said in Matthew 23, starting in verse 34, "Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar." Wow. Yeah. Anyway, so continuing in verse 11, it says, "And now," this is God speaking to Cain again, "and now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you've driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." Then the Lord said to him, "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, and Nod means wandering, east of Eden. So once again, God couched his judgment upon this murder in terms of cursing the ground, just as he had with Adam. Let's see. And it says God also told Cain that he'd become a wanderer on the earth, and there's another play on words here because Nod means wandering. What's most tragic about this is that it says that Cain went off to wander away from the presence of the Lord.
Now he was making his own mind up about that.
Yep.
Yeah.
We don't have any way of knowing whether Cain eventually repented of this murder and of the covetousness that led up to it, and of the lie that he told in bearing false witness. We don't know if he ever repented of that and was redeemed by the blood of Jesus. If not, it's a tragic story indeed.
Well, you look, my punishment is greater than I can bear. You didn't kill me like I killed my brother. How can he say that? And, you have driven me away.
Mm-hmm.
And from your face I'll be hid. He's declaring, and he's not got anything to stand on. When you really look at it.
sometimes it takes us a long time to
I
repent.
know, but I mean, we do that. But I mean, look how blatantly it is.
There's something intriguing here that's hidden in plain sight. Cain says in 4:14, "Whoever finds me will kill me." And in response, God says, "If anyone kills Cain, and he's going to take vengeance." And that begs a question in my mind. Where did these whoever's and anyone's come from? Right. So far,
Yeah.
the only names we have are Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. Right. So this tells us for sure that there were others that aren't mentioned by name. Right. And that's an important fact to realize when we look at these genealogies, and actually lists of names everywhere throughout the Bible. We need to remember not everything's in there. Not everyone's mentioned. A lot of people are also Rands, right? So starting in verse 17, we have the story of the descendants of Adam and Eve going up to Noah's flood. First, we start with a short list of Cain's descendants, and then we return to Adam and Eve that follows the lineage of their son Seth, through whom Jesus eventually came, down to Noah and Noah's family, of course, were the sole survivors of the flood. Before we look at those genealogies in detail, I wanted to share with you some little fun statistics that bring an important truth to bear. No genealogy is ever complete. No genealogy in any of the texts of the world is ever complete, and they couldn't possibly be. Consider, though, the possibility that we might be able to write down all the names of all the people who have ever lived, if we knew the names, of course. And just suppose that we could write those names each in a space 1/8 of an inch tall and 1 inch wide. That's easy with a name like Jim, maybe not so much with Chedorlaomer or some of the other long names. So scientists estimate that there have been about 100 billion people alive in the world. We throw that word billion around. Now, don't ask me how they came up with that number, but let's just roll with it for a minute. If we had to write 100 billion names, each name in a space 1/8 of a square inch, it would take us 16,000 acres of paper, or about 7 million 8.5 by 11 letter-sized sheets. And furthermore, assuming that one person could write one name once per second, it would take them 3,200 years to write down those 100 billion names if they worked 24/7. And of course, the project would be doomed from the start, because in the time it takes one of those people or one person to write one name in 1 second, 4 new names would be added to the list. So we could get around that by assigning at least 5 people to do the work, right? So if 5 people were writing one name per second, it would only take them 640 years to write those 100 billion names. But in that time, another 80 billion would have been added. But they could eventually complete the task. But then, of course, they would have to devote their lives full time for the rest of all eternity just to maintain the genealogy that they'd finally completed, right, as new names are added. And that's just to write down the names without considering the family relationships. And, y'all know me, I very rarely, I won't say I never do, but I rarely use the word none or always or never in my writing, But in this case, I'm comfortable in saying all genealogies are necessarily focused on limited groups of people for specific purposes, and none of them are complete. In God's Word, all of the genealogies are focused from one pair of progenitors, Adam and Eve, to one descendant,
One
Jesus,
line.
Jesus of Nazareth. They're all focused on that line, and that's to drive home the point that God, the Son, came to earth in the form of Jesus of Nazareth in fulfillment of prophecy. The first prophecy being that one that God uttered to the serpent in Genesis 3:15 about the seed of the woman. So with that said, let's look at Cain's descendants. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Enoch means dedicated. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and that means fleet. Irad fathered Mahuyael, and that means smitten by God. Mahuyael fathered Methushael, which means who is of God. Oh, there's a better one. Methushael fathered Lamech, which means powerful. And Lamech took two wives. The name of one was Ada, which name means ornament. And the name of the other was Zillah, which means shade. And that's actually Tzillah. Tzedek is that's the letter. Ada bore Jabal, which means stream of water. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal, which means stream. I guess they weren't very, you got Jabal and Jubal. Kind of like George Foreman naming all of his sons George, right? He was the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. Zillah also bore Tubal-Cain, which means you will be brought of Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah, which means loveliness. So that's all that God has to say about the line of Cain, right there in that passage. There's a couple of notes that I wanted to point out. First of all, in Genesis 4:17, Enoch, we find the first instance of a name that's later reused. This Enoch that's mentioned here as the son of Cain is not the same as the Enoch in Genesis 5 who walked with God and was not, who was the son of, we'll get to it, Jared. Similarly, the Lamech mentioned here is not the same as the Lamech who was Noah's father. So these are two reused names already. And whenever we look at genealogies in God's Word, we need to always be vigilant to remember that they reuse people names in particular. So you need to be on the lookout. And if we make it, when we get to Genesis 36, the genealogy of Esau, it gets really, really complicated. And it's funny because I when we were down in the Midlands and I was preaching in the rotation there at Calvary Chapel of Leesville, Genesis 36, came up on my ticket, right? And I did a long message about this and wrote out a bunch of charts for Esau. That message is the most viewed post on my website. I get hundreds of hits on it from strange places like Indonesia. I get a lot of hits on from Muslim countries because they're very interested in Esau and Ishmael. Not so much in Jacob and Israel. Anyway.
I wonder why.
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Well, they're working on it if they're looking at what you write.
But it's a pretty complex genealogy. If we get to Genesis 36, God willing, we'll look into it. But there's something else about this passage that perturbs me. I don't know can you guess what it is? In verse 20 through 22, regarding the sons of Ada and Zillah, 3 times in those verses, Moses said he was the father of all those who do something. Not did something, who do something. Remember, almost all of these people died in the flood. But that brought home to me something I'd never realized before. Almost every one of them died in the flood. You know, biblical genealogies very rarely mention women's names. When they do, it's important women that have something else later in the story, like Tamar, or Deborah, or in the New Testament we find Joanna and the three Marys, right? That had significant roles to play elsewhere outside of the genealogies. The genealogies very rarely mention women, but there are three women mentioned here, the wives of Lamech and his daughter, right? Why? What I think is that the descendants of these three women became Noah's daughters-in-law, who aren't named.
Could the term "the father of all who did this" or all that just mean that he began that industry?
Well, that's the thing that bothers
It
me.
wouldn't be a.
He doesn't say the father of those who did this. He says the father of those who do this. Remember, Moses was writing this.
It would still go down, but it wouldn't go down necessarily through a genealogical lineage. But he was the first to do all of this, and everything came from him. It's like George Washington's the father of our country type usage.
Yeah, but not all of George Washington's line died out at a flood. That's what I'm saying. Right?
Well, when we talk about George Washington being the father of our country, it has nothing to do with his physical lineage.
Right. Yeah,
I'm saying it could be used in that sense, that these industries or these skills or whatever for the human began with him and were passed on to.
So not really a
physical
father, but a father of an idea. It could very well be. Anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves on this whole thing with Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And by the way, it's little wonder that Mahuyael, smitten by God, never gained much traction as a popular baby name. Right? Anyway, so continuing on in verse 23, this is a very strange passage. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. Sounds like a real great guy. I honestly don't know why this is in here. This is one of those things that I have to assume that God will reveal to me his purposes for putting this in eventually when I need to know it, when it can be of service to me in serving him. But in the meantime, I really have no idea why this is in here. So at this point, the line of Cain gets left behind in the story, and they go back to Adam, or Moses goes back to Adam and Eve to follow the line of Seth. In verse 25 it says, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and called his name Seth. Seth's name means compensation, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Now, remember, God had said that through her offspring, the serpent's head would be bruised, right? So they knew that there would be more offspring, even if there weren't already, right? To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh, which means man. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. Now, I found that very intriguing. Yeah. People began to call on the name of the Lord, all right and good, right? But notice the word Lord here appears in uppercase. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we know that whenever that happens, what we're looking at is Yod, He, Vav, He, the tetragrammaton, Jehovah. Right? But Moses himself wasn't told God's name until thousands of years later at the burning bush. And even then, when he asked him, who shall I say sent me? When they asked me, God said, I am that I am. Even then, he didn't use this name, Jehovah. He said, I am, which in Hebrew is Haya. So how could Moses know what people thousands of years were calling the Lord? It brings home a point. Sometimes the scribes that God uses to write his word don't know themselves what they're writing. Don't realize the significance of it, but they're obeying the Lord. Now, just a caveat here before we press on. I hope I'm not disappointing anybody, but something that I'm going to ignore from now on, mostly. Calculating the specific dates and times based on the ages of the what do they call those guys? The patriarchs, right? Lots of people have written lots of words about this, and if you want to look into it, look into it. Some have taken this practice to the nth degree. There's some guy, I forget who it was, but he did all these calculations, and he calculated back the exact day and hour that God said, let there be light. The 4th hour of Monday, October 7th, 3761 BC. I'm sure he had a great deal of detailed calculations. And if you're interested in it, go look into it.
Well, basically, those calculations are what the Gregorian calendar is based on. I mean, not that guy's, but...
Well, and there's a lot that's been written about the 70th week of Daniel and 360-day years, and from the day that the decree went out for the rebuilding of Jerusalem until, what does it say? Does it say Messiah comes? Mm-hmm. It's in Daniel chapter 9. 70 weeks are decreed for you and your people to bring an end to sin, basically, which hasn't happened yet. Well, we brought an end for the necessary punishment for sin, I guess, when he died on the cross. But sin itself still runs rampant.
Another note about the genealogy is the fact that we just have the genealogy down basically through. I mean, there's a little bit about Cain, but basically down through Seth.
Seth to Noah.
Well, the thing is, if everybody died except Noah and his family in the flood, all the other genealogies are meaningless anyway.
Yeah, actually, Paul said something. We're actually about to get to that.
Oh.
But the other thing about this calculation goes, people have been devoting a great deal of energy to predict the day and the hour when Jesus will return, right? And many people, some of whom you would not pick. Like one that really shocked me was Pastor Chuck Smith, Calvary Chapel, right? One of my favorite Bible teachers, right? The one under whom I, cut my teeth theologically. He came out in 81 and said, in 1981, this is going to happen. Chuck, have you not read? Concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only.
When I was in seminary, there was a guy that put out a little paperback thing on 88 reasons why the Lord is going to return on October the 8th, and this was 1988. Mm-hmm. And one day we went out and someone had put a copy of that under the windshield wiper of every car on seminary campus, So we were all talking about that. It was interesting. There was in one of my classes a guy said that someone asked him, well, and this was like a week before that was going to happen. He says, if you knew that was to be true, what would you be doing between now and then?
That's an important question.
He said I'd be going to work, and then I'd be coming and taking my classes at seminary because that's what God's called me to do.
Amen. You know, there's a great internet meme, and it has a picture of an Oreo, and it says, Mayan calendar says the world's going to come. Oreo cookie says it's A-OK. Right? It looks just like that Mayan calendar. Anyway, so before we launch into this genealogy that, you know, from Adam to Noah, remember what Paul said to Titus. And he also said this to Timothy in slightly different words. In Titus 3:9, he says, but avoid foolish controversies, genealogies, dissensions, quarrels about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. Now, nevertheless, we find this genealogy in the text that we are considering, right? So we are going to consider this genealogy. We're not going to skip over it. You know, and we do find some insights in this list, particularly the story about Enoch, which is very intriguing. Genealogies in themselves are not unprofitable and worthless, despite what Paul said to Titus. It's the controversies, the obsession over them that are unprofitable and worthless. And guess what? The Jewish leaders have been and were in Jesus' time and continue to today to obsess over these genealogies. And something that's very interesting.
Not just the Jews.
Oh yeah. Something that's very interesting that I learned in Israel the first time was, you know, the priests all come from Levi, right? The kings all come from Judah, right? But the priests all come from Levi. Well, after the Babylonian captivity, most Jews could no longer identify their tribe. Right? The genealogies were lost. And then in World War II, that problem was compounded to the nth degree because the Nazis burned all the records. They burned the births, the deaths, the marriages. There's a great story our tour guide told. He wanted to get married. Well, in Israel, you must be married by a rabbi, right? And in order for a rabbi to marry you, you must be a Jew, right? And you are a Jew if your mother was a Jew. Well, you're a Jew if your mother was a Jew or your grandmother was a Jew, right? They don't care about your father because they reason that everybody knows who your mother is.
Yeah,
we're not quite so sure about your dad, right? But so he's trying to get married, and his mother is there being interviewed by this rabbi. And the rabbi looks down his glasses at her and says, Elizabeth, that's not a Jewish name, right? Ignoring John the Baptist's mother, by the way, which of course they don't believe him.
Yes.
And she says, well, Elizabeth is my middle name. Rachel is my first name. And that is most certainly a Jewish name. And so he says, well, Ronnie, that's not a Jewish name. And she says, well, it's short for Aaron. And that most certainly is a Jewish name. And about this time, Ronnie said that if his mother hadn't been there, that rabbi would have passed out cold on the floor. Right? Because he was mad. And the guy looks down his glasses at her and says, are you sure you're a Jewish man? And she says, well, I've been called a filthy Jew my whole life, but I guess that's not good enough in the state of Israel. Anyway, so we won't obsess on these genealogies. We'll take them for what.
We'll note them and
Yeah.
move on.
So this is the book of the generations of Adam, and this is in Genesis 5, starting in verse 1. Adam, of course, means man. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. And Seth means compensation. We looked at that a minute ago. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Adam that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Now, Genesis is devoted to this genealogy from Adam to, or Genesis 5 is from Adam through Seth to Noah. Seth's line eventually led to the tribes of Israel, and through one of those sons of Israel, sons of Jacob, Judah, King David arose, and then out of King David's line, Jesus came eventually. This genealogy takes a poetic form, and every stanza of the poem ends, except the last one, and one other that we'll look at in a minute, ends with the phrase, "and he died." Every stanza except for the last stanza, contains the phrase, "he had other sons and daughters." So therefore, we have the answer to the question where Cain found his wife. To the modern mind, it's maybe not such a pretty thing to consider, but clearly Cain's wife must have been one of his sisters or nieces or grandnieces, right?
Great-great-grandnieces.
But his wife had to have come from Eve, right? Somehow. Same as he did. Before we move on, notice that God says that Adam fathered Seth in his own likeness and after his image. Does that wording sound familiar to you? Remember, God said that about Adam in Genesis 1. Mm-hmm. Let us create man in our image and after our likeness. So in verse 6, when Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. And that also means man. Seth lived after he'd fathered Enosh 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. That means possession. Anybody remember another one that means possession? Cain means possession. This is an alternative spelling. Enosh lived after he'd fathered Canaan 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. When Canaan lived 70 years, he fathered Mahalalel, which means praise of God. That's a better one than that smitten of God that we saw earlier. Canaan lived after he fathered Mahalalel 840 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he fathered Jared, or Yared, and that means descent. Mahalalel lived after he fathered Yared 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. When Yared had lived 162 years, he fathered Enoch, which means dedicated. Yared lived after he fathered Enoch 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Yared were 62 years, and he died. Now, as promised, I'm not going to pay any attention to those ages and years. Thousands of words have been written about him, and many timelines have been constructed. And a lot has been made of the fact that these people apparently lived much longer than we live today. And there's really no need for us to add to that pile of knowledge.
That's right.
And I said, such is left as an exercise for the student. Notice in verse 9, I talked about Canaan meaning possession, just like Cain. Cain's son Enoch is not the same person as Jared's son, mentioned here in verses 18 and 19. And in verse 21, it says, when Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. I turned that off earlier. I swear I did. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah, which means man of the dart. Enoch walked with God after he'd fathered Methuselah 300 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So obviously Enoch is a person of particular interest here. This stanza of the poem doesn't include the phrase, and he died. It does include the phrase, he fathered other sons and daughters, or had other sons and daughters. Of course, there's been a great deal of not controversy, but discussion and what you would call it, speculation about what Enoch's apparently not having died the way everybody else does means, and particularly with regard to possible future events involving him. For example, it's been proposed that Enoch and Elijah, the other person who didn't die in the normal way, will be the two witnesses that Revelation talks about. You can read about that in Revelation 11. These two witnesses prophesied for, 300 days or something like that. And then, of course, they were calling out the beast. The beast didn't like that, had him killed. And they lay in the street for 3 days, and everybody was happy that they died, and then they came back to life. Nobody liked the fact that they could speak and burn people with it, because flames shot out of their mouths and things like that. So they were happy to see him go, but then they came back to life. So maybe that was Enoch and Elijah. Who knows? Enoch is mentioned outside of the genealogies in two places. The first place is in Hebrews 11:5 that we just looked at. We looked at Abel, but Enoch was the next one in the Hall of Faith. Paul talks, whoever wrote Hebrews talks about how his faith rescued him out of death. And then there's one other reference to Enoch, a very cryptic reference in Jude. Jude 1:14, that talks about a prophecy that was uttered by Enoch. It's not known from anywhere else in the Word. Jude is the only one that mentioned it.
I was thinking that was one that is from a apocryphal book or something. That
could be, or one of the other Jewish writings, but it's not in the Word that we have.
No, it's not in the Bible.
So, continuing on in verse 25, when Methuselah had lived 187 years, he fathered Lamech, which means powerful again. And this isn't the same Lamech that was in the line of Cain, the guy that gave that lovely poem to his wife. Methuselah lived after he fathered Lamech 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, which means rest, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. Lamech lived after he fathered Noah 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. After Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, and that means name. These guys are really imaginative. Ham, which means hot. Everybody loves hot ham. And Japheth, which means opened. And we'll look at those in detail in the order that they were born in later on, after the story of the flood. Now, I know I promised I wouldn't acknowledge these names or ages and years, but you can't go by Methuselah, right? 969, the most long-lived man that we have in the Word of God, right?
And the interesting thing is, if you do the timeline genealogy, he died the year of the flood.
And we know, by the way, that Lamech must have had a very fulfilling life because he lived 777 years. Right? 7's the number of fulfillment, right? So let's see. In verse 28, we find the next messianic prophecy. in Lamech's word, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. And of course, this is a reference to salvation out of sin's curse through Jesus, who was descended from Noah. Let's see here. But before God brought this respite through Noah, he was about to bring a huge catastrophe, and we'll talk about that next time. The great flood that Noah and his family played a central role in. And that was all I had.
Yeah, again, not dwelling a lot on the timeline, but if you take anything on those timelines, that means that during this time that Noah was building the ark and everything, and the Bible says that, you know, everybody was corrupt except him. That includes Methuselah and Lamech and
Yeah.
even, I mean,
All
Adam.
those that are still alive. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk about that when we talk. There's been a lot said about that, about the Nephilim and the sons of God who left their rightful place and all that stuff. We'll talk about that.
And even later, when they built Babel, Noah was still alive. You know, it's just.
Yep.
The heart of man.
It's interesting. They've shut it down for, I think, 10 years. But there's a museum in Berlin called the Pergamon Museum. And you mentioned the Tower of Babel. Babel is, Babylon, the city of Babylon, which is, the Tower of Babel was somewhere in the plain of Shinar, which is the land between the rivers, that Fertile Crescent. But the thing about it is they built with unfired brick. And so...
And bitumen.
Yep. And so rain eventually washed it all away. But the Ishtar Gate in Babylon, famous for you could ride 4 chariots across on top of the wall, right? Mm-hmm. It was sheathed, or it was clad in fired tile that was lapis lazuli colored, dark blue colored. And some, as the Germans in the 1800s were fond of doing, some German went to Babylon and gathered up all the blue tiles he could find, shipped them off from Berlin, and they rebuilt the Ishtar Gate with these tiles, and you can go to the Pergamon Museum. They also stole the entire city of Pergamon, Turkey, which is why the Pergamon Museum is named, and the Turks want it back, by the way.
And that way they can blow it up.
Well, there's a problem with the Pergamon Museum, that it's sinking underneath of it, so they're doing all this hydraulic cement work underneath of it, and it's going to take forever. Pergamon Museum is very interesting because, if you look at the pictures of World War II, you look at Cologne. Cologne was completely flat for 15 miles all around the center of the city. The only thing that was standing was the cathedral. The railroad station, which was flattened, is right next to the cathedral. You can go to the cathedral today, and the shrapnel from when they bombed that railroad station is still up in the towers of that cathedral. Same thing with the Pergamon Museum. Everything around it was powdered. You know, remember, these guys have been day in, day and night bombed for at least 2 years prior to that. Every day, every night. They were bombing anything that looked taller than a 3-foot block wall. They had air superiority, and they used it. I like what McNamara said. If you ever read McNamara's book called The Fog of War, it's his apologetic for when he was Defense Department during Vietnam. And he said, people talk about what I did in Vietnam. It was nothing compared to what I did for Curtis LeMay in Japan during World War II. McNamara's job during World War II was to figure out how they could get the most fire for the least amount of money. And they just burned Japan to the ground.
Not to mention dropping a couple of nuclear bombs.
Yeah, but
that's a good way to burn things.
Yeah, but if you look, they dropped nuclear bombs on flat cities that were already flat. They've been firebombing that area for months. The nuclear bombs were spectacular. And of course, Truman let it be assumed that we had a bunch more. Those were our last two, and we wouldn't have had any more for at least 6 months. There's a great book called Quartered Safe Out Here. It's about the Burma campaign. And in the foreword, the author says, modern historians have put forth the idea that Japan was ready to surrender and there was no need to drop the atomic bombs. And he said, I wish those guys could have been with me on August 6th, 1945, when the guy came out of the jungle wearing nothing but a loincloth and armed with nothing but a bamboo spear. He was in no mood to surrender, I assure you, and I had to shoot him dead.
Yeah.
Anyway, I thought that whole, you mentioned the Tower of Babel, and it reminded me of it. Because if you go there today, there are all these heaps of just mud. Well, those used to be structures. Those used to be ziggurats in ancient times. But because they used that unfired brick, it just all melted away back into the desert.